Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you could join us today. Welcome to Matan's webinar about the pledge that we designed last year that helps to recognize ability, disability, and humanity all together. I am really pleased to introduce Ruti Regan, who will be facilitating this webinar. Ruti is Matan's Rabbinic Disability Scholar in Residence, and she has long combined her Jewish and disability knowledge in order to advance both fields. And we're very fortunate to have her both with us at Matan and also with us here today on this webinar. This webinar is being recorded, so you can watch it again later on or share with your colleagues. I am going to go ahead and mute everybody so that everybody can hear. If you would like more information, about Matan, our website is www.matankids.org. The pledge can be found at tinyurl.com/Matan Pledge, and I will put that into the chat comments as well. And as you all know, you should have received an email. This webinar is being live captioned. You can look in the chat box for the link to click on to view the live chat, or it was also sent to you via email. And now, without further ado, I am happy to introduce Ruti Regan.
All right. So, hi everyone. This is the Matan Pledge webinar, and we're going to talk about the Matan Pledge we created last year to get a sense of the importance of recognizing disability, ability, and humanity in practice, and how in practice to do all three simultaneously, because they're really all key and fundamental to getting. Okay, it doesn't seem to want to share the full screen, so one second, I'll do the sharing a different way and then it will work. Excuse me. So you know what. Apologies, 1 second, and then. Okay, so while I'm waiting for the screen to come back and behave itself, so I'm going to talk a little about the Matan Pledge and what went into our decision to create the pledge. We've heard a lot of inclusion talk that downplays the importance of disability and says things like, look past the disability and see the person, or there's no such thing as can't, or, you know, we don't see disability, we just see kids. And as people who think that disability is actually really a fundamental part of who people are, we wanted to create a pledge that would help people have the right mindset about disability. And really, the reason that we created the Matan Pledge because inclusion is hard. Inclusion is hard partly because teaching is hard. Teaching is hard just because getting information across to people who do not already have it and might not see the importance and need to have a lot of background knowledge can be a very difficult task. Teachers have a hard job. And over the many centuries that teaching has been a thing, teachers have done a lot of great work figuring out how to teach people of different ages, cultures, backgrounds, places in life. And every teacher receives a lot of previous generations and then adds their own, which they then pass on to subsequent generations of teachers. And if teachers had to start from scratch and figure out how to teach everything all by themselves with no received generations, teaching would be a lot harder. we talk about inclusion, we're a lot closer to that situation than we are to the situation of most other kinds of teaching, because people with disabilities have been excluded from schools, have been institutionalized and segregated. And because people were not included, previous generations of teachers didn't develop the knowledge for teaching for teaching people with disabilities that really on the level and at the depth that we've had for teaching students without disabilities who have been presumed to be part of the group, which means that inclusion is hard because teaching is hard, and it's harder because we don't have the developed skill sets. So those of us who are working on this now, all of you, are really at the forefront of creating this knowledge, and it will be a lot easier for generations. This is the knowledge that will change the world. Don't get discouraged. Understand that it's hard because it's hard, and it's hard because attention to the problem is a relatively recent development. So given that we're all developing more knowledge than we're receiving, one skill that we emphasize with Matan is the skill of looking for the questions, because sometimes we don't even know the right questions to ask to figure out how to make inclusion work, to figure out how to get information across to a particular kid, adult, person, congregant, participant, whoever. So the to focus values, and it's also a tool to help you find the right questions. And so I'm talking about the pledge. Pledge has 3 elements: recognizing the significance and meaning of disability, recognizing the fundamental abilities of our students to do things that matter, and recognizing the fundamental humanity and uniqueness of every student, person, learner we encounter. So humanity, everyone's a real person, everyone's unique, everyone has thoughts and feelings, everyone learns and grows. This sounds obvious, but our culture implicitly teaches us to assume that some people do not. So recognizing humanity of students with disabilities on a full level is actually very countercultural and something that we have to do on purpose. And we'll talk about the details of that a bit more later on in this conversation. But ability. Everyone has abilities, everyone can develop their abilities, everyone can do things that matter. And again, sounds obvious. We've been taught to ignore certain people. So in practice, this is something we have to do on purpose, cannot assume that we're doing automatically. That ends up being very countercultural. One way that it ends up being countercultural is that we're told that disability is not something we should acknowledge, when actually recognizing disability is of fundamental importance in both recognizing ability and recognizing full humanity. So let's talk about the importance of disability. It's very important to understand that disability is important. What disability means and what disability doesn't mean. What disability means is that your body works differently than most other people's brain and body in ways that are uncommon in general, but in which you should probably share with some other people. And disability is important because bodies are really, really important. Because brains are really, really important. And related to that, life experiences are also important. And people with disabilities have a lot of life experiences that are different from those of people who are not disabled. And so when we're asking questions, often what we're really asking are often the questions we need to be asking are about disability. How does it affect things? What does it matter? What does it mean? What is the student's physical, cognitive, and social reality that we're dealing with? And so one thing, part of asking the right questions about disability is don't try to look past it. A lot of people say, you know, we need to look past the disability and see the person. The disability is part of the person because bodies are important, brains are important, and life experience is important. If you try to look past disability to see the person, you're treating an imaginary friend. If you try to look past the disability to see the person, what you end up seeing is your own reflection and your own ideas of what that person should be and not who they really are. And your reflection is not very useful to your students, to your congregants, to your learners, whoever you're working with. They really need you to see the person they are and the reality they inhabit. Asking questions about how disability matters is part of teaching well when you're being inclusive. How does disability matter in this teaching situation is a question that we need to be asking ourselves on an ongoing basis, even if you don't have any students with identified disabilities in your group, because it's always part of the world, part you can always know. So again, don't look past disability because you need to see your students, not your own reflection. And think about the difference disability makes. Disability makes a couple kinds of differences. There are primary differences that are differences in how someone's brain or body functions. There are secondary differences that arise as a result of differences in experience. People's brains are different, their bodies are different, and all those differences are important. So primary physical or cognitive differences, like somebody moves differently, has hearing loss, or blind, autistic, whatever. Secondary differences come from differences in experience. Like if you move differently, your interaction with every object or person you interact with is probably going to be different, and that shapes people. Likewise, if you can't get into certain buildings, that's going to shape your life experiences. And there are a lot of different types of differences. Some secondary differences, not all, come from the social are being misunderstood. There's a lot of active discrimination against people with disabilities. That's something that we need to bear in mind in inclusive education because it always matters. The social experience of not being understood by your teachers also has a profound impact on how we teach people with disabilities because it affects establishing trust, it affects communication, it affects what level of trust is reasonable. Because again, we have a lot of accumulated generational knowledge developed over time about how to teach students without disabilities. Less knowledge about teaching students with disabilities and teaching inclusively, which means that when we work with students with disabilities, we're going to make a lot more mistakes. We're going to misunderstand them a lot more, a lot of the time. And that affects the teacher-learner, educator-learner relationship. And that's something to be aware of, like making sure that we're paying attention to what the relationship is, how trust is working, how much we're understanding and how that's affecting things is part of the. So to give some examples of primary differences, like moving more slowly than other people the same age, not being able to walk, not having the motor skills to hold small objects, having more trouble climbing, having uncontrolled body movements, having taking longer to learn to make a motion. Secondary differences might be if you can't pick up motions quickly and move at the same pace, it's going to be real hard to participate in Israeli dancing in your Hebrew school program, or to have that Israeli dancing bonding experience at Havdalah at camp. Or you're going to perhaps, if you read and print, the books you have access to will be different. If you move more slowly, the things you prioritize or experience at a number of levels can be very different. And that's just, it affects everything pervasively. And it's not the only thing that matters. And it's also something we can't afford to ignore because it's important. So secondary differences related to stigma and discrimination, both in childhood and in adulthood. Every learner, every level, everyone we deal with, this is important. Kids grow up spending most of their time, if not all, in educational environments that were not designed with them in mind and which are less competent of children. And that's even more true. The older you get, the more true that becomes. Yeah?
I'm just going to jump in for a second. There's a point pretty much on every slide where the sound is fading out for a moment. And luckily we can see the words on the screen, and I think it's pretty pretty easy to figure out what you're talking about, but I just wasn't sure if there was something on your end. I don't see you moving away from your headphones or anything like that, so I'm not sure why it's happening,
Okay.
but I just mentioned it.
Maybe the sound goes out. Okay. So maybe the sound goes out while I'm clicking the slide. So I'll not talk while I'm clicking the slide and see if that helps.
Okay.
Okay. So again, growing up in an environment in which you spend most of your time, especially the older you get, the more complex things, in an environment that assumes people like you are not present or shouldn't be present or don't need, has an effect that it's hard to even describe. And kids often experience being referred to as failing repeatedly before they're even old enough for kindergarten, as though being a toddler is something you can flunk. Kids often experience disappointing adults in their lives in ways they really have no control over. And kids often, as a result of adults not wanting them to feel different, don't have anyone in their life who will talk about difference, and can experience a lot of very difficult things without the emotional support that really all kids need. And again, this also affects adults. Adults experience, the older you get, the more educational discrimination there likely is. There's also employment discrimination, increasingly. And, so being left out of adult education because inclusion is about children with special needs. Being seen as solely a recipient of services, not a potential leader. Not being able to get in the building community events are in, or experiencing employment discrimination, having trouble finding someone who will hire you. All of that has a lot of impact. Okay, I think I will skip this for now. All right, so, but the thing about primary and secondary differences, and these, as I've described them, all sound very negative, but that's not the whole story. Primary and secondary differences related can be positive and can be experienced in positive ways and can be part of somebody's identity and self-image in a way that's integrated. So one secondary difference, which can be profoundly positive, and I've certainly found this to be so myself, is participation in disability culture. Disability culture has a lot of really great things to offer that, unlike inclusive education, have a lot of generations of development behind them. And disability communities often regard primary differences as very, the deaf community that communicates in ASL puts a lot of value on being deaf and talks about deaf gain rather than hearing loss. The autistic community has a positive view of flapping, other forms of stimming, intensely focused special interests, echolalia, repetitive stuff that's often dismissed as non-functional or negative. So we really can have a positive self-understanding of who we are. And I think that as an educator, it's important to understand that difference is not necessarily bad. So speaking of disability culture, bring in a couple of examples here. This is Stella Young, who was a stand-up comedian, a woman with a physical disability, and I've put in the slide a link to the TED Talk. GA was not your inspiration. One of the things she said about pressure to focus on positive thinking instead of disability is no amount of smiling at a flight of stairs has ever made it turn into a ramp. Never. If we want to know that ramps are important, we've got to think about disability and why people need them. Similarly, smiling at a television screen isn't going to make closed captions appear for people who are deaf, or I'd add, like, have auditory processing issues or have English as a second language or whatever else. If we want people to be able to understand the things we're teaching, we've got to provide captions so that people know what words we're saying. So again, paying attention to disability allows us to take access needs seriously. No amount of standing in the middle of a bookshop and that it's going to turn all those books into Braille. It's just not going to happen. If we're looking at our own reflection, trying to look past disability and blindness, we're not going to understand that Braille is important and that our students need Sidorim, prayer books, Torah, all of those things available in Braille if that's the form they read in, or another form if that's the form they read in. We need to see not only uniqueness, but also similarity to other people who are similar. The perspective on this, on both primary and secondary difference, is from Harriet McBride Johnson, who was a lawyer and advocate with muscular dystrophy, who is known for, among other things, starting an annual protest of the Jerry Lewis telethon because she thought, and I agree, that it was devaluing the lives of people with disabilities. And she had this to say about understanding our bodies in positive ways. For those with disability shapes all that we are. Those disabled later in life adapt. We take constraints that no one would choose and build rich and satisfying lives with them. We enjoy pleasures other people enjoy and pleasures peculiarly our own. We have something the world needs. Taking that attitude to disability can make a profound difference in your ability to teach in a way that is inclusive, in a way that is humanizing and real. So getting back to the Matan Pledge, we say, I will not look past their disabilities, I will seek to understand. And there's a whole world of, but we have a few examples. One question to ask is, how does disability matter here? How does disability affect my students' physical or cognitive experience? How does it affect their perspective, their worldview, what they might be thinking and feeling? Where are the barriers and how can I build bridges? I would also add, So these are some questions. There are many others. I encourage you to ask both ours and yours. So let's talk about recognizing ability. So from the Talmud Kiddushin 31a, and it's a source that I think that some of you may have seen in the context of talking about women in mitzvot. It's Rabbi Yosef, who himself was blind, was talking about his obligation to perform the mitzvot, the commandments. And there's a dispute over whether blind people are or are not biblically obligated to observe the Jewish commandments. And he'd said, at first, I thought it would be great if people said that blind people are not obligated to perform them. I perform them anyway. But then I heard an opinion that says it's much better to be obligated and keep the commandments and do it as a mitzvah than it is to do it voluntarily just because you want to. And so now I'd say if people say that I am obligated, I'll throw a big party for them. And I think this idea of obligation is really important to think about when we're talking about recognizing ability, because sometimes we focus on flexibility when we want to be inclusive, and that can be good because sometimes people do need different things, ways. But if we move into seeing our students with significant disabilities as people who have no real obligations, that ends up being dehumanizing and robbing them of recognition of their abilities and contributions. So I think that asking the question, are we seeing our learners as people who have Jewish obligations, is a question we should be asking. How are we helping our learners learn to know in order to meet their Jewish obligations or broader social obligations? It's also a question I think we should ask. And part of how we need to ask this is by getting as far as possible beyond the category of people bring unique gifts, which I've seen in a lot of religious talk in Jewish settings, in interfaith settings. It's this idea that we're all created in God's image and we all bring our unique God-given gifts to the table. And that sounds good, except that it's not really enough. if we focus on our unique God-given gifts, it ends up sending the message that the only thing we have to offer are the things that came from God. And I don't think that's true of anyone. And I think we kind of get that it's not true of anyone with people who do not have disabilities. But with people with disabilities, sometimes we fall into the pit of thinking that people with disabilities only have our unique God-given gifts to offer. But we have more than that. We can also offer the things that we from us, the things that we created, the things that we did meeting our obligations. We have thoughts, we have opinions, we have knowledge, and we have accomplishments. And our ability to have those things came from God, but the things we've created came from us. Our ability to create came from God. The things we create came from us. And both we and God deserve the credit, and both we and God did seen as significant in all of this. Another way to put it is Moses was not an inclusion student. He was not just there giving other people the moving feeling of including him. He did not just offer his uniqueness, although he did offer his uniqueness. Moses was significantly disabled, had a speech problem, tried to reject his mission because he was afraid of what his speech problem would mean. And God said, I know who you are. You're the one I want. Go lead. And he did. And I think that when we're thinking about inclusion, we need to think about not just bringing people into the classrooms, but into bringing people into education for leadership and seeing people as people who can teach as well as learn, who can create as well as receive, who can reciprocate help as well as receiving it. Recognizing uniqueness is not enough. It's essential, don't get me wrong, but it's not enough. Everyone's unique. Not everyone has a disability. The differences between disabled and non-disabled people are really important. And the things that people with disability have in common with each other, either all people with disabilities or people with similar disabilities, those areas of difference and commonality are both not something we can ignore. So in some ways, this is similar to the concept of developmentally appropriate practice, right? All people are unique. Most people the same age have a lot of things in common. And teaching preschool is real difficult. And if what you have is professional experience teaching adults and a fundamental appreciation of the uniqueness of all people, if you go into a classroom of preschoolers with nothing but that, you're probably not going to be very successful at teaching them. And when you're teaching a mixed age group, age similarities and age differences are both important. If you're teaching 5-year-olds and 10-year-olds together, understanding the difference between the motor skills and attention span that 5-year-olds typically have versus that 10-year-olds typically have is really important. Similarly, if you're teaching, it's important to understand that it's not reasonable or developmentally appropriate to expect them to sit through a lecture and take notes. So you need to understand, and it's also not reasonable to treat all 4-year-olds as interchangeable, all 10-year-olds as interchangeable, all adults as interchangeable, because we're all different. So you need to appreciate the differences and the similarities in order to teach successfully. So developmentally appropriate practice, we've had certain information about. Developmentally appropriate practice isn't enough, because what developmentally aware teachers develop a sense of is what's the range of difference among most people the same age? Like, what do most 10-year-olds have in common? How is that different from what most 12-year-olds have in common? The thing about disability is that people with disabilities are more different than that. People with disabilities have things in common with each other not have encountered before. And developing disability-aware practice means increasing your understanding of the differences and the similarities. So Disability-informed teaching is teaching in a way that takes disability into account, understanding disability well enough to account for it in a way that's constructive and conducive to education. Sometimes it can be universal design. Universal design means designing things in a way that they work for everyone. For instance, when you're building a building, making sure there's a flat entrance, people don't have to walk upstairs to get in. Planning from the beginning for it to work for everyone. So another concept is differentiated instruction, which means students learn the same material, but different students might learn in different ways or have adaptations. For instance, like kids might all be learning about the Parsha for their bar mitzvah, simplified written information in order to account for their reading levels. Some people might need visual supports. Some people might need communication supports that are different. And there is a lot out there on how to differentiate for various needs. And there's also even more that we just don't know yet. So this is where learning what other people know is really hard, but also be aware that you're going to encounter a lot of major unsolved problems to which you can make contributions that change the world. When that happens, understand that it's hard because it's hard, it's not you. So inclusion is a pedagogical content knowledge problem in part. So pedagogical content knowledge is understanding your material, but not only that, also understanding what your material looks like to your students who are learning it, including when they say certain things, what might they be thinking? What they might be making? What might be their preconceptions? What is it likely that they know, don't know, can relate to? And there's a lot of that that's age-based. There's not enough that's disability-based. For instance, like if you're making an analogy between walking and running, how is that going to be understood by a student whose experiences have been different? If you're teaching adults Hebrew by making reference to things learned in camp, how is that going to work for someone who was excluded from camp because of other people's reaction to their disability? If somebody has hospitalized a lot, what are they going to be familiar with that you might not otherwise assume for people their age? And any number of other things. Thinking about not only the needs, but the perspectives and worldviews of students with disabilities is part of figuring out how to teach them. Another part of recognizing ability is honoring can't and getting beyond the concept of trying real hard. When kind of presentation in person, one thing I'll often do is stand in front of the room on a chair and say, if I flap my arms real hard and believe in myself and my ability to fly and jump off this chair, is that going to end well? People often look very nervous about my chair climbing, which of course is why I do it. But just like that, kal v'chomer, all the more so, if I believe I can fly and I stand at a cliff and flap my arms real hard, that's not going to turn my arms into wings. Believing in myself won't create the ability. Trying hard in that situation won't end well. It will make matters worse. So just try it, keep trying. Can be a good tool, but there are some situations in which it can do real harm. Can't is important. Part of supporting ability is acknowledging the things that we can't do so that we can find the things that we can do. Banning can'ts, as a lot of teachers do, say there's no can't in my classroom. Banning can't does not create abilities, it creates silence. It says that the things that you can't do are unspeakable and you need to shut up about them. But in reality, my limitations, the ability exist whether or not we're allowed to discuss them, and our bodies don't go away when we're supposed to pretend they don't exist. And so, most people have the depth perception to be able to understand where objects are in space and catch balls. I can't do that, and I also can't drive safely. And I regard these as pretty neutral facts, like on par with the fact that, you know, I also can't fly, so what really? But other people sure seem to get freaked out when I say can't about some things most other people can do. It's okay to be different. It's okay for your students too. And whether it's okay or not, it's reality. And we can't help them by pretending things aren't true. Disability acceptance is the opposite of giving up. Accepting disability is what makes it possible to work with your body rather than against it and to find adaptive strategies. To put it another way, if you accept that your arms aren't wings, then you can invent an airplane. So if you want your students to fly, don't pretend they're birds. Help them to find or create airplanes, or help something to better use of their time than learning how to fly might be. But don't pretend that they're birds, put them on the edge of a cliff and tell them to try real hard, because at best it'll be demoralizing, and at worst it can do a lot more harm. So having a disability means doing things differently. Sometimes when people say, I don't see disability, what they mean is, I think disability means inability, or that calling someone disabled, I expect nothing of them and think they can't do anything. That's not what disability means. Disability does not mean that we can't do anything. Disability means that we cannot do everything, and that we have some physical, cognitive, or social experiences that are different from most people's. And we can't do some things that most other people can, or that we can, but in a different way. So again, this goes back to primary and secondary differences. How well these guys work is a primary physical difference. Whether or not that means they're immobile is a secondary difference, caused by, for instance, some people have secondary immobility because they need wheelchairs and don't have them, or because they need wheelchairs and aren't allowed to use them because other people want them to not, quote unquote, give up on themselves and keep trying to walk, even though it's painful, inefficient, and they can only go a few steps. So accepting the things that we can't do physically and us figure out the way that we can do the higher level secondary things differently. And adaptation is really a skill that I think our society has in a lot of ways, especially when it's age related. We're often very matter of fact about adaptation that's done for age related purposes. And we could be this matter of fact about disability adaptation. The fact that we are not is a cultural problem. It's okay to be different. It is. It's okay if you can't do certain things, and it's okay if you don't know what you can do. It's okay to be different, and it's okay to have things in common with other people with disabilities. So one way inclusion can go wrong is because segregating people in special education settings or in institutions like Chas v'Shalom is a really bad idea, and it's done tremendous harm. Something that has been done in an attempt to repair that harm has also done great harm, because sometimes people think that inclusion means that people with disabilities need to be isolated with each other and should not see ourselves as having anything in common. That, you know, you're just a kid, you're just a student. And it's like being a woman, or it's like being gay, or, you know, or like being Jewish, really. These differences are important, and when we're in a group where nobody is like us, knowing that other people like us exist can be game-changing. It can be game-changing in terms of self-understanding, and it can be game-changing in terms of access to adaptive strategies. So understanding the importance of similarities between people with disabilities is part of inclusive teaching, even if there's only one learner with a disability in the context you're teaching in. So disability and the need for adaptation in response to the fact that some people can't do certain things is not a situation that calls for freaking out. It's one that gets freaking out, but it's not one that calls for freaking out. Training wheels are kids use to learn to ride a bike. A lot, which because kids of certain ages don't have certain motor development. Similarly, some people need bikes to be different or stabilized in a different way because they don't develop those motor skills and still want to ride a bike. Needing a different kind of bike is just a fact of life. It does not call for freaking out. We can be matter of fact about it. Likewise, ramps for bowling or mobility, big crayons for little hands, or adapted writing utensils for people who need to write and need to not do it in the usual way. So taking this matter of fact, like let's look at what people can and can't do and how to work with that rather than against it, that we know how to take for children in a developmentally appropriate way, that we often know how to take for seniors in a more matter of fact way. Like for some reason, it's socially acceptable for seniors to use walkers in a way that it isn't for people who are the same reason. But so like, what if we took the skills we already had at just acknowledging physical reality and developing ways to account for it in education and in life, and applied that to disability in the same way we apply it with age, like youth, aging, any number of other things. If taking that attitude doesn't make the problems go away, but it does make them a lot easier to solve. Another thing that's part of recognizing ability is acknowledging the right to do hard things. One place acknowledging go really badly wrong is that sometimes people push the expectations down to almost zero because there's this idea that everything needs to be successful or we'll get too frustrated, or that learning needs to be errorless, or that if we're frustrated and expressing feelings about it, that's a problem that needs to be solved. And sometimes frustration means something's going wrong, but sometimes frustration means something's going right. Sometimes frustration, experience frustration when we're really committed to figuring out how to do something and haven't yet figured out how. And part of recognizing ability is creating space for people with disabilities to do hard things, to attempt things we might not succeed at, to persevere in things that we might not succeed at or that we're having a real hard time with. And I don't mean push people with things, but do recognize that we have the right to do hard things just like everyone else. And being frustrated and having feelings about it is often just part of learning. And it's okay for everyone. And it doesn't mean that the expectations need to be dialed down to zero. And this can also even be a self-reinforcing spiral sometimes, because sometimes a student's having a hard time, people try lowering the expectations, which can sometimes be the right thing to do, but then the student, because of anything that's a good use of their time, they're just like, you know, pointing to orange over and over again. And then since they're still frustrated and refusing to cooperate, that might get interpreted as inability. And then the expectations might be reduced even further. So if you're trying making something simpler or easier and that's not working, try making it harder, because sometimes the problem is that it's not hard enough. It's not deep enough for a good use of someone's time. So if an adaptation is not working, it's worth asking, should I be making this harder rather than easier? Is there a way to make this a more meaningful challenge? Not always the right approach, always something to consider. So getting back to this, getting back to the Matan Pledge, say like, I will not overlook ability or disregard ability. I will seek out. So again, we have some questions. We encourage you to ask both ours and your own, but some we ask is, what support can enable my students to do more things? Good to ask that about all students in general, particularly about students with disabilities who often are really just not going to have the support they need. Another question to ask is, how am I making room for both can't and can? How am I acknowledging things that some of my learners cannot do physically because they're not capable of them, and making room for can in a way that accepts those limitations? Or if you like metaphors, am I expecting students to be birds or helping them to find airplanes? How? And this is a mistake we all make from time to time because assessment is hard and because we're all guessing. So don't beat yourself up. Do be on the lookout for this. Another thing to ask in terms of recognizing abilities, are learners with disabilities leading? Are they creating? Are they doing hard things? Are they being seen as people who contribute or only people who receive? Are we talking about their needs all the time, or are we also talking about their creations and accomplishments? So those are some questions to look for. We also, again, encourage you to ask your own. So back to the final part of the Matan Pledge is about recognizing humanity, paying direct attention to whether or not you are recognizing the humanity of each and every student. This is profoundly countercultural with students with significant disabilities. It is something that we need to do on purpose because our culture has taught us to systematically overlook their perspective. And I've seen this in literally every context, including conferences I've been at where the whole theme of the conference was presume competence and recognize that people with disabilities have a perspective. Even at a conference I went where that was the sole purpose of the content of the conference, all of the material was directed as though everyone in the audience was not disabled, and everything about disability was said in terms of they, and not you and not we. And that is okay that it's almost invisible a lot of the time. So let's talk about how do we get past that. Let's talk about Tosefta Kiddushin. This is one that I think is taught in a lot of education classes. And it's written about the obligations of a father to a son. Most of them apply also to daughters. Obligations of a father to a son are to circumcise him, health permitting, to redeem him from, if he's a firstborn, to teach him Torah, to teach him a trade, to marry him, to they also say to swim. Rabbi Yehuda goes so far as to say anyone who does not teach his son a trade, it is though he has taught him robbery. And I've noticed that in education for learners with disabilities, we tend to focus a lot on childhood, and even the childhood focus sometimes talks as though childhood is lifelong. And for boys, education aimed at B'nai Mitzvah, on the 8th day, we express the hope that they will marry and to learn Torah and to do good deeds. And this is often an expectation that has an implicit, but only if you're not disabled, because people with disabilities are not real adults clause. Because again, disabled adulthood looks different than non-disabled adulthood. And we don't have the skills to anticipate what it will look like to the extent that we do with typically developing students. When we teach children, keeping in mind that there is a move towards adulthood and growth, regardless of what someone's physical and cognitive abilities are, it's really important. We grow up and we continue developing throughout our lives. And while it's the case that some people do not survive childhood or are not expected to survive childhood, nevertheless, people grow and develop. And a lot of people who are not expected to survive childhood do. And I know a lot personally who are much older than anyone told them to expect that they would ever be. So we should never assume that there's no need for adulthood. And we should never assume that somebody's limitations deprive them of adulthood, because whatever somebody's abilities are or aren't, there's a big difference between a 5-year-old and a 50-year-old who has an intellectual disability. A typically developing 3-year-old has 3 years of life experience. A 90-year-old with an intellectual disability has 90 years of life experience and has been through puberty with all that implies. We need to understand that the difference is important. And when we teach children, educate for emerging adulthood, and when we teach adults, teach in a way that recognizes adulthood. So how do we do this in practice? And how do we do this from a Jewish perspective specifically? I think one way we can do this is by looking at what the Haggadah teaches us, because the Haggadah is probably, the Seder, the Passover Seder, is probably the most popular. Don't do anything else. We don't even go to shul on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah. Often do have some sort of Seder, and most people do recite some form of the 4 sons, the 4 children. I say sons because I want to emphasize age neutrality. As of yet, I haven't figured out a way to do both age and gender neutrality. But we have this idea in the Passover Haggadah of 4 different types of learners, which I think it would behoove us to pay attention to when we're thinking about Matan Pledge. So what does the Chacham say, usually translated as wise? What are the rules, the testimony, statutes, and judgments that God has commanded you? You'll teach him all the detailed answers of the rules of Passover, even up to the point of like the nitty-gritty about the afikomen. And I think that often we feel like this does not need to be said, but we're really not always kind to the Chacham. The kind of enthusiasm that the Chacham has is really not always welcome, especially when it's disruptively detailed or not exactly the topic we know. When you're teaching like a lesson about Shabbat, and you might say like, it's to thank God for like giving us food. And there's that one student who's like, yeah, but it says who brings forth bread from the ground. How does it get from the ground? Bread doesn't grow in the ground. And asks a whole bunch of detailed questions about that. But totally derails your lesson plan. And that can be really frustrating. And there's these kids who are very verbose and enthusiastic about these interests, who might be called, real smart or the little professor. Doesn't mean that they're being listened to, heard, or respected, or taught appropriately. Because the Hacham's questions, it can often be dismissed as showing off or as a perseveration or as like not respecting other people, when really it's just how to communicate. And recognizing that disruptiveness is not malice, and that this is just part of learning for some people, is part of being inclusive. And from an autistic perspective, I can say that most autistic people who can talk or communicate in words have had the experience of being fundamentally confused by most of the things they're surrounded with, adults or teachers or peers want them to care about. And then there's finally this one thing maybe in school that makes sense and it's fascinating and you're supposed to be interested in it and you are. And then you ask a bunch of questions and then somehow even that's wrong. And so just thinking about the inclusion challenges that are related to the Hacham or the wise son, child, daughter, learner is part of inclusion. And we shouldn't assume that perceiving someone as smart means that we're including them effectively. So, and then there's the Rasha, which is usually translated as the wicked. Rasha say, what are we doing this for? What are you doing this for? Traditional answer in the Haggadah is said, what does this mean to you and not to me? And since he excluded him from the community, himself from the community and took himself out of it, you respond harshly, set his teeth on edge and say, for the sake of this, did God do for me and my going out of Egypt, for me and not for him? Because if he had been there, he would not have been, he would not have been. So this is real harsh. And I think that most of us would, at least on our better days, not be inclined to teach this way. And I also think that there is some real depth in the Rasha about what it means to recognize somebody's humanity in inclusive teaching. Because we're not innocent subjects, right? One of the most dehumanizing things people say about disability is, oh, people with Down syndrome are so sweet and sunny. Like, they have a smile that would break your heart. Autistic people are so... No, we're people. We do things for reasons, and sometimes good reasons, sometimes bad reasons, but we do things. And seeing us having the capacity for wickedness and rebellion that comes from us and our minds is part of seeing us as human. And the good thing about the response to the Rasha, the saying, like, having this harsh emphatic response, is that we're taking them seriously enough them capable of believing things that are threatening. And if we assume about a student, well, they must not really have meant that, they're, just not themselves, it's a sensory thing, then we're not really respecting them as people, because we need to engage with their perspective, their beliefs, and their reasons, and often not just the behavior. So related to behavior, here, one thing I'm real sick of hearing about disabled people, like people are being supported, is, oh, she had a behavior, he has some behaviors. People don't have behaviors. People do things. We have our reasons. Sometimes we have good reasons, sometimes we have bad reasons, sometimes it's complicated, but we always have our reasons, and there always are reasons. And treating behavior as something that's just like fundamentally external to us is dehumanizing. Engaging with your learners as people who do things and have thoughts and reasons is fundamental to respecting them as human. Behaviorism cannot replace that. Often translated as the simple son, child, learner, student, daughter. So what does the Tam say? What is this? You'll say to the Tam, God took us out of Egypt with a mighty hand from the house of slavery. And you explain to him what's going on, tell the story. We're not always so nice to the Tam either. Sometimes we have a real hard time taking Tam questions. People who ask simple questions are often dismissed as lazy, like, oh, what's wrong with you? Go freaking Google it. How do you not know that? Or they might be laughed at, perceived as making a joke, because of course everyone knows that. Well, sometimes they don't, either because it's confusing to them or because their life experience has not given them the chance to learn it. Like, somebody who has never been welcome in camp might genuinely not know in year 1 Hebrew class what chadarochel means. And chadarochel is the word that means that people who've been to camp will know that word. Not everyone goes. Sometimes people won't know or understand things that seem really self-evident to you. And so part of inclusive teaching is to respect sincere ignorance and to presume good faith and to make room for people to ask questions that seem simple. One of the profound insights I think is that part of the ritual is asking the simplest questions about what's going on, making sure that those questions are asked and answered, because most of the Haggadah is a bunch of rabbis going off on confusing high intellectual tangents. And without that reminder, we could very easily miss the point. So remembering that people might not know things and that there needs to be room and safety for revealing ignorance and asking questions that seem simple fundamental part of inclusive teaching. Not know how to ask. It's the fourth child, son, daughter, participant, learner, student. Regarding one who does not know how to ask, you will open up the conversation for him. As says in the Torah, you will speak to your son on that day, saying, for the sake of this, God did for me in my going out of Egypt. You don't wait for somebody to prove that they understand the story before you teach it to them, because if we waited for that, people might never get there. If people aren't asking, they need to know that they have an obligation to know, and that it's our obligation to teach it to them, to recognize that they need to know, and to help open things up for them. So it's a lot of reason people might not be able to ask. Insecurity or anxiety, expecting from past experience that they will be ignored, lacking background information, not being sure what kind of questions are welcome, not having a method of communication others understand, or others might not be willing to listen to them, or others may have by others that they can't learn. So keeping in mind that silence is not absence is part of inclusive teaching. And we call it in various communities presuming competence. Students often understand much more than they can prove that they know. And it's important not to wait for students to prove that they understand before we teach them. It's important, we need to keep trying, keep asking the question, how can we open up possibilities for them to ask their own questions? We keep trying, we keep offering openings, keep addressing them directly, and respond in a way that they understand, because whether or not they understand our question, they understand that we're trying to communicate with them, and that can stop people from giving up. Watching for communication, being proactive about listening, finding ways to support communication, making referrals for communication support, all of that can be part of how we recognize humanity and make space for everybody's questions and everybody's participation in the Jewish conversation. Question, where first saw this image that's on the screen. It's of a child in a wheelchair surrounded by two children who are standing. I thought it was a great image of inclusion because they're all together. And my friend pointed out to me that the kids who are not seen as disabled are holding papers. The kid who is seen as disabled is not holding a paper. So this kind of thing happens an awful lot. And it's important to ask, where's his paper? Is this a picturesque picture of inclusion? Or is it something that's making us feel moved, but is actually moving the learner with the disability out of the way? So I need to wrap up in a minute. But it's important to learn from disability community. Torah taught me that we're all created b'tselem Elohim, in God's image. Disability rights community taught me how to mean it, even though many of them are atheists. God didn't put me on the street to provide disability awareness training to everyone who happens by. Yeah, part I agree with. In fact, no God put anyone anywhere for any reason, if you want to know. That part I don't agree with, but honorable men can differ. Seeking out perspectives of adults who are like your students is also part of recognizing who they are. Remembering we're not interchangeable, and treating all of your students as individual people, not instances of disability. Don't talk like an IEP. When we're advocating for services, we have to use deficits-based stigmatizing languages to make the case for them. One of my IEPs said that I had inappropriate breathing patterns, okay? We shouldn't talk that way about people. Some contexts people make us. It's not because of disability, it's because of culture. Don't do it when no one's making you. And realizing people are not clay. People with disabilities into their image of either what they think people should be, what inclusion students should be, what people with disabilities should be, what empowered self-actualized people should be. Thing is, we're already people. God already made us in God's image. We don't need you to be remade in your image. So watch that when you're teaching. getting back to the pledge, some questions to ask about respecting humanity is, are the feelings of learners with disabilities respected? How? And how do students with make mistakes and figure things out? Are you seeing a person? Are you seeing a treatment plan? So again, those are some of our questions. We encourage you to ask your own, and the recording and the slides will both be available after. And just to wrap up, we'll read through the Matan Pledge. So Matan's Disability Acceptance and Inclusion Pledge. I acknowledge that ability, disability, and exist, and I just see my students as they are. I will not look past their disabilities. I will seek to understand. I will not overlook their abilities. I will seek to support them effectively. I will not ignore the humanity of my students. I will remember that they have individual interests and a perspective of their own, and that they were each created B'Tselem Elohim in the image of God. All right.
Thank you so much. Again, Ruti Regan, Matan's Disability Scholar in Residence. My name is Meredith Polsky. I'm the National Director of Institutes and Training at Matan. You can reach out to either of us through Facebook or Twitter. I put our links in the chat, or via email, Ruti, R-U-T-I, at matankids.org, or Meredith, M-E-R-E-D-I-T-H, at matankids.org. Thank you so much for joining us, and be on the lookout for future webinars. Thank you so much, Ruti.